Palestini.
Estoy muchas gracias.
Levantemos nuestra voz. ¡Viva Palestina libre! ¡Viva! ¡Viva! ¡Viva la paz! ¡Viva!
Hello and welcome to all our friends and viewers joining us from the United States and throughout the world. We are so excited to have you all with us today as we dive into the recent uprising in Palestine and what it means for Palestinian liberation in our lifetime, what it means for the mass movements for justice in the US and across the globe, and the role that a revolutionary organization like the Freedom Road Socialist Organization can play in moments like these. So, quick introduction. My name is Cassia Laham, and I am speaking to you all live from somewhat sunny South Florida. And I'm so honored to be moderating this discussion today and to be introducing two amazingly talented and fearless activists and organizers that I am very lucky to call comrades. Tracy Molm will be joining us from Minneapolis and Kobi Guillory in Chicago. But before those two dig into the implications and lessons of the most recent events that we've seen in Palestine, allow me to just quickly introduce myself and the organization hosting this event. So as previously stated, my name is Cassia. I have been organizing in the movement for Palestine and the larger anti-war movement for about half my life now. I was protesting the war. Some of my earliest memories of activism were protesting the Iraq War in high school. I helped to co-found the University of Florida chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine, co-founded anti-war group called Power down here in South Florida. And I've served on the administrative committee for the United National Anti-War Coalition for over 6 years now. And as an Arab American whose family hails from Syria and Lebanon, two countries that have been targets of US imperialism for decades and continue to be so, resisting US imperialism isn't just something I care about, but it's very much a part of who I am. And it's for this reason, more than anything else, that I joined the Freedom Road Socialist Organization over 10 years ago. So the FRSO is a revolutionary organization based within the multinational working class and oppressed nationality movements of the United States. It's rooted in the principles of Marxism, Leninism, and proletarian internationalism. And the FRSO maintains that the principal contradiction in today's world is between the peoples of the developing nations and the developing world and imperialism, and that The fact that the United States is currently the principal imperialist power in the world today, that means it remains the #1 danger to the people of the world today, and the main force to really be opposed. So from Syria to the Philippines to Palestine, people are rising up, people are fighting for liberation, and the FRSO supports those struggles for liberation from the greedy, violent, oppressive shackles of US imperialism. So specifically when it comes to the issue of Palestinian liberation, we maintain that Israel is a colonial settler state, that it occupies and oppresses the people of Palestine in a way that is only possible with the assistance of the United States. For decades, the United States has supplied the billions of dollars necessary and the thousands of weapons of death and destruction necessary to Israel in order for them to continue their brutal occupation of Palestine. And the United States does this in return for having an ally and a staging ground in the Middle East from which it can plan and launch offensives against the people of that region. Those who rule the United States profit from this relationship, lining their pockets with these defense contracts that we've heard so much about, that Joe Biden, by the way, just gave a lot of money. So I'm sure one of our speakers will speak to that. And it allows us to go into various countries and extract the resources and expand the reach of US empire as a continuation of that manifest destiny that we've all heard of. So Freedom Road for decades has stood staunchly against Zionist occupation. We've maintained for years that the only path forward is the creation of a singular, secular Palestinian state from the river to the sea, with the right of return for all those displaced and forced out since the creation of the State of Israel. Recent events in Palestine have once again proven this line to be correct, and I'm happy to see many others on the left and throughout the progressive movements of the world starting to come to that same conclusion. So the FRSO has championed the cause of Palestine, not only in rhetoric, but in action, whether it was defending Rasmia Odeh, whether it has been through collective organizing within our local communities. We have put our words into action. And for that, many members and friends of the FRSO have been targets of political repression for their positions against US empire, and for the amount of courage and solidarity it took them to stand for those fighting for liberation. And one of those people is actually with us on our webinar today, and I'm really proud to call this person a comrade. And so this is a perfect transition to introduce our first speaker, a brave resistor, a member of the Anti-War 23, which I'm sure she'll tell you a little bit about. From Minneapolis, Minnesota, we have Tracy Molm. So Tracy, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you so much for having me today. In 2004, I went to Palestine on a solidarity delegation representing the Anti-War Committee in Minnesota. For 10 days, we traveled around throughout the West Bank and parts of the occupied 48 territories, seeing firsthand the occupation and meeting with families affected by Israel's brutal apartheid tactics. But we also witnessed the great resistance of the Palestinian people fighting for their land. And 6 years later, that solidarity trip and my continued support for the Palestinian resistance landed me and 22 others in the crosshairs of the FBI, like Cassia was mentioning before. They raided my apartment along with the 4 other homes in Minneapolis and 2 homes in Chicago, and we were subpoenaed to a grand jury in Chicago. All of us, the Anti-War 23, refused to speak to this grand jury that they had subpoenaed us to. Instead, we relied on the support of the people and movements that we've been organizing with, some people for decades. And not once did we back down in our support for the Palestinian resistance and resistance movements around the globe. After a year of no one cooperating with the grand jury, the US government arrested Rasmia Odeh and charged her. She's an icon of the Palestinian liberation movement. She's known throughout the Middle East and is a woman to be admired, fighting her entire life for Palestinian liberation, speaking out against brutal torture that she endured in an Israeli prison. She's organized Arab women in Chicago and consistently joined in struggles for justice for all types of movements. She used her torture and her case to shed light on the atrocities of the Israeli apartheid government. We were able to keep her in the US for 4 years longer than the US government had planned or wanted because we did fight back against these charges and we built a movement around it. All of this basically is the short way of saying that I've been part of organizing and supporting the Palestinian people and resistance for many years. And today in particular, I'm really excited to talk about the latest attacks by the Israeli colonial settler state, but most importantly, to talk about and congratulate the Palestinian resistance that were victorious against the Israeli aggressors. They landed incredible blows against an enemy that is funded by US imperialism. During these 11 days of fighting, the US media often referred to it as a fight between Hamas and Israel. But in fact, it was a fight between US funded and supported Israeli forces against a united Palestinian resistance forces. Gaza, the West Bank, and the occupied 48 territories stood strong, calling a general strike that crippled the Israeli economy. Palestinian resistance was joined by Palestinian refugees and supporters in neighboring Gaza, or in neighboring Jordan and Egypt, where they came through a border that is defended by the IDF, and they stood strong against those forces. There were also Palestinians in the Golan Heights that were resisting the occupation in that area as well. It was actually an incredible show of force by resistance forces. In Freedom Road, we salute these brave fighters that stood up to this incredibly armed and dangerous force. And we celebrate these amazing victories that the Palestinian resistance achieved with these united forces. They landed more blows against the Israeli apartheid regime. More rockets were fired at Israeli targets than ever before, and the arc of resistance from Iran to Palestine has been re-energized by this victory. Now, Cassia talked about it a little bit, but I want to talk more about how the Israeli occupation in Palestine is made possible by US financial, military, and political support. President Biden's response to this latest attack was atrocious. He continued to fund the Israeli apartheid regime, giving them more money for weapons, and calling their bombing campaign a proportional response. Not once acknowledging the uneven power balance or the clear targeting of civilian locations like a COVID testing facility in Gaza. The Biden administration follows Trump in recognizing the illegal annexation of the Golan Heights and Jerusalem as the capital of the Zionist state. And the Biden administration also continues to criminalize Palestinian resistance, labeling all groups as terrorist forces. And this support for Israel continues because it is a tool for US imperialism and for US corporations to loot the resources, the land, and the peoples of the region of the Middle East. The US uses Israel along with reactionary Arab governments like Saudi Arabia to keep a stranglehold on the entire region. And when governments stand up for their sovereignty or support the Palestinian people, they're met with war and sanctions, like in Iran and Syria. This right now, what we're seeing is the revolutionary and resistance forces winning. And that can't be emphasized enough. The revolutionary and resistance forces in Palestine are winning. This is a new high point for the resistance in Palestine on the road to defeating Zionism and Israeli apartheid. When the Palestinian resistance stood strong, the Arab people stood with them. It was a blow to US imperialism. As I talked earlier, this came because of a united Palestinian resistance. And FRSO stands in support of all of those fighting against the Israeli regime. But we're socialists, and we don't treat all groups equally. We particularly support the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, seeing it as the group representing the working peoples of Palestine. We salute in particular the role of women fighters in their organization and in this most recent upsurge. Freedom Road has consistently stood for a single united Palestinian state, as Cassia mentioned before. Many people over the course of time have called for a two-state solution, calling it practical. But the Zionist Israeli government has shown time and again that they have no intention of being equal or fair partners, that they even can be negotiated with, especially when you consider the oversized role of the US government in funding that regime. One secular Palestinian state is the demand of the PFLP and the demand that Freedom Road continues to fight for. Right now, revolutionaries and those in solidarity with the people of Palestine have a very important role to play. We must end aid to Israel, US aid to Israel. We must fight to make the continued support of US politicians funding the apartheid regime, we must make that untenable. Now, recently, we saw the first time the US government had a bill that actually questioned US aid to Israel, and that's a good start, but it's not enough. We need to make it a liability to support the Israeli government. And we need to, as part of that, we need to support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movements that are part of that resistance. But we also need to take to the streets and fight and to join in protests around the country, some of them shown in the great video before. Every act of resistance and solidarity is a step towards liberation for Palestine. Israel exists on stolen land and borrowed time, and the occupation will be defeated. I want to end with my favorite chant. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Thank you.
Awesome, Tracy. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Hell yes. So from there, gosh, as you were talking, I was just sort of taking notes here and I was thinking, man, yeah, the most practical thing is a two-state solution. It's like, no, the most practical thing is freedom and liberation. So how about we choose the plan that's best for that? And, you know, as always, the Democrats and Republicans are always going to be united in their support for US imperialism. And, you know, therefore the Israeli occupation. So we've definitely learned that in the past few presidential cycles for sure. All right, awesome. Tracy, a true warrior, a true hero. Next up, we have another warrior and hero, Kobi Guillory, who actually just got back from a delegation to Syria, and he'll be speaking about that actually on a future webinar. And as somebody whose family hails from Syria, I'm pretty excited to hear about that. But today, Kobi will be talking to us about the movements for Palestine in US cities during the recent uprising and the connection between the movement for Palestine and the movements against racist police violence and the oppression of the Black community in the United States today. So without further ado, take it away, Kobi.
Thank you, Cassia, and thank you everyone who's watching. I do just want to say one thing about when I was in Syria, and this is something that I didn't really, that had never really been expressed to me, is that, you know, support for the Palestinian resistance is, as Cassia said, a part of Syrian national identity. You know, as a part of their upbringing, as a part of their culture, everybody supports the rights of Palestinians to be free and to, you know, have self-determination and have control over their own land. You know, that's something that is just very important to recognize, is that this is something that is global. You know, imperialism is a global system, and imperialists, you know, want to remove the right of self-determination from all oppressed nations everywhere. So in 2003, Colin Powell actually went to Syria and made these demands that the Syrian government needs to, you know, stop supporting the Palestinian resistance and needs to normalize relations with Israel. And they said no. They sent him home in a cab. They, excuse my language, they basically told him to fuck off. And that was when they started ramping up aggression against Syria. They said, you know, if you want to go out like that, we can target you just like we're targeting Iraq. But they didn't turn out like Iraq. They didn't turn out like Libya. You know, they won against imperialism and they're beating it back every day. So I say all of that to say that, you know, a win against imperialism anywhere is a win against imperialism everywhere. So when Syria got that victory against imperialism, that was a loss to Israel, that was a loss to the United States and to all of their allies and their junior partners imperialism. And that strengthens, like Tracy said, that strengthens the axis or the arc of resistance against Israel and against imperialism in general. So what that means for us in the US is that we're in a unique position where we're in the belly of the beast. We're in a place where we can reach out and shut down imperialism from the inside. That's the purpose of the anti-war movement. And that's our purpose as revolutionaries. That's what we need to spend our time doing, to do everything and anything we can to shut down imperialism, give people all over the world the right to determine their own destinies. Someone in Syria said to me, you need to get Joe Biden to lift those sanctions. And I said, we're trying. America's not a democracy like you don't have a democracy like you have here. But we're trying, we're fighting. And he said, yeah, it's your responsibility. You need to fight. You need to fight harder and you need to get those sanctions lifted. And I think a lot of people don't really understand, what sanctions do to other people and what to people in other countries and what US intervention does to people in other countries. It ruins people's lives. It restricts people from getting healthcare, from getting access to food and medicine and water. So we need to fight imperialism on a moral basis, but more than on a moral basis, there's a strategic necessity to fight against imperialism, because we in the US are oppressed by the same system. We as Black people and as other oppressed nations and as working class people, we are oppressed by the same system that oppresses Palestinians, by the same system that oppresses Haitians, the same system that oppresses people all over the world, South America and Africa and Asia. So in order to overcome that system, we don't have the resources that imperialists have. We don't have the money, we don't have the same weapons that they have, but we do have people power. The one thing that they can never do to us, as much as they use all these tactics of torture and of imprisonment and bombing campaigns and killing indiscriminately, we have the numbers. So the one thing they can never do is outnumber us. But in order to use our numbers, we have to be united. Which means, as the Black Liberation Movement here, we work with Palestinians. Palestinians work with us. We're in solidarity with so many different movements, and that solidarity is something that we have to build over time and to express not just in words but in actions. For example, in 2014, in Ferguson, Palestinians noticed that they were using the same tear gas canisters on Black protesters in Ferguson that they had been using on Palestinians. So they, started tweeting out, "This is how you deal with this certain kind of tear gas." So that is those kinds of connections, those sharing each other's tactics, sharing knowledge, sharing theory with each other. That's how we build those connections and fight back against imperialism. And that's very important, again, because when we say imperialism is a global system, we don't just mean that it's everywhere, but we mean that imperialists everywhere work with each other. That's why we have. That's why they're the Israeli occupation forces and U.S. police are using the same tear gas canisters. They're manufactured by the same companies. The Israeli occupation forces train police officers in the U.S. And the U.S. government, of course, as I think Tracy and Cassia both mentioned, they give billions of dollars, billions of our tax dollars are given to the Zionist occupation to continue to terrorize people, to continue to tear families apart and occupy people's land. So when we have the situation where imperialists are working together, we need to work together as enemies of imperialism, as oppressed people. So I say all of that to say that this past year, these past 2 years, 2020 and 2021, have been years of the most, you know, vigorous mass uprisings that I've ever seen. You know, I haven't been alive that long, but others who've been around in the movement longer than me have said that, you know, they've never seen anything like what happened in 2020 after George Floyd was killed. And what we saw then was a spark of solidarity all over the world. In Syria, so many people mentioned George Floyd to me by name. You know, they, as soon as they heard, oh, this is a black person from America, you know, they said, you know, Black Lives Matter. They said, one person said to me that the example of George Floyd proves that there's no democracy in America. You know, that kind of analysis is something that oppressed people have all over the world, because they are in support of our liberation struggles over here. So this year, when the Israeli occupation forces raided Al-Aqsa Mosque, started removing people from their homes, Sheikh Jarrah, started bombing Gaza, all of these things, all of these atrocities that the imperialists are committing, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people got out in the streets and, you know, voiced their condemnation of the Zionist occupation entity. Here in Chicago, it was amazing to see. It was this exponential growth. The first protest had about 500 people. The second protest had about 10,000 people. The third protest had 25,000 people. So every single protest, and this was it within 8 days, between the first and the third, they were 8 days apart. Every protest was exponentially larger than the one before, because people are so activated and people understand that this is a time to resist imperialism and to resist colonialism. And, you know, this was happening all over the world. In Dearborn, there were 250,000 people in the streets. There were protests in South Africa, protests in Kenya, different states, even, you know, China condemned what Israel was doing at the United Nations Security Council. And of course, Syria and Iran materially helped the Palestinian resistance. And that wave of solidarity, that's what gets victory. That's what wins us battles against imperialists. What we have to realize is that, you know, the oppressor doesn't have a conscience, or the oppressor is not going to stop oppressing us because of you know, arguments of the conscience, or just telling them, well, this is the right thing to do to you know, to give people their land back and stop killing children. They don't care about that. You know, the only thing that is gonna move them, that is gonna end oppression, is resistance. Is when we unite and fight back in resistance. And the last thing I'll say is part of what solidarity means when we say we stand in unconditional solidarity with oppressed people all over the world, Palestinians, with Filipinos, with Haitians, you know, what that means is we don't tell them how to resist, and we don't tell them how to organize themselves or how to fight back. Something that I noticed, a similarity between what was happening last year during the George Floyd rebellion and what is happening this year with the Palestinian resistance, is every news pundit, whenever they talk about the resistance in Palestine, they talk about, you know, this violence on both sides, and, you know, you have to condemn Hamas's rocket attacks. You have to condemn the Palestinian resistance, essentially, is what they want people to do. But and they said the same thing last year. They were saying you have to condemn the looting, you have to condemn the riots, because that's the real problem. You know, they're trying to divert attention away from what caused the resistance, what people are actually fighting back against. And you know, what we have to be very clear on is that we're not condemning people for fighting back. We're condemning colonialism, we're condemning white supremacy, we're condemning imperialism, and the fighting back must continue. You know, so when people are fighting back, we don't tell them how to fight back, we support them. And that's And that's something that Palestinians do for Black people in the US. And that's something that Black people historically, Black liberation movements in the US have done for Palestinians. And that's what we're going to keep doing. So the last thing I'll say, all power to the people. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Thank you.
Hell yeah, Kobi. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. Viva, viva Palestina. We have the solidarity in the house tonight. And what Kobi said is absolutely correct, which is, the best way to combat imperialism is through international solidarity. And Kobi really nailed it with that speech and showing what international solidarity means in this moment. And listening to you speak, Kobi, I was thinking, even in South Florida, we had but the largest protests we've ever seen as well. Down here in Miami, I mean, that's never happened. We've never seen thousands upon thousands of people flood the streets of Biscayne Boulevard, of South Miami, of Miami Beach, Fort Lauderdale. I mean, all of these major metropolitan cities. Even in we haven't really seen that. And this time we did. And, we have been organizing for Palestine for a long time. So this is really, truly an unprecedented moment, I think, in the resistance. And I think with that, and I don't know if, maybe Tracy and Kobi both want to speak to this, or if either of you want to take this question. I know we're going to go to a Q&A if folks have them in the chat, but I had some questions as well while you guys were speaking. And one of them sort of harkens to that, which is, in what way was this moment of resistance different than in years past? And, we can sort of tackle that from the perspective of Palestinians, or we can tackle that, from the perspective of people here, and maybe both. So if either of you guys would like to take that question, in what way this moment was different, why did this create different reactions, whether it was in Palestine or in the United States?
Well, I'll add a few things and hopefully others can add on that. But, it was definitely a historic moment in that all of the Palestinian resistance was united, but then also seeing refugees and supporters from Egypt and Jordan streaming in, fighting back IDF forces to join in the resistance in Palestine was monumental and a thing that hasn't been seen before. And so I think that the uniting of the Arab world in this moment is definitely historic. And the general strike is definitely historic. Often, many people believing this heralding in a third intifada, which I think is, it's the time. People are ready to resist.
Yeah, most definitely. It was the most unified effort against Israeli occupation that we've seen, for sure. Kobi, did you want to tackle any part of that question?
Yeah, just something about like resistance movements in general. Like it was the same in South Africa, where, the apartheid governments in South Africa, they thought that they had cut the resistance down when they arrested Nelson Mandela, chopped up the networks of Mkhonto we Sizwe. But 10 years later, the uprising just sprang back up again. So as long as the conditions haven't changed, as long as people are still being oppressed and people are still being colonized, the land is still owned by, or not owned, but occupied by imperialists and colonizers. People are still going to resist, so and every wave of resistance, history goes in spirals. Every wave of resistance is going to be stronger than the one before it, which is why also the George Floyd rebellion was so huge, is because, for years and years and years, after decades of mass incarceration and decades of systemic disinvestment and neglect of Black and brown communities in the US, people are tired, and people will, they just need a spark, whether it's George Floyd being murdered, or whether it's the raiding of Al-Aqsa Mosque. People are just waiting for that spark, and then, the flame of resistance just, ignites.
Sorry about that. Yeah, that's absolutely, that's something that was going through my mind as well. And I was also thinking, as you guys were talking, I was thinking in my head about how these movements sort of reached their breaking points at the same moment, right? I mean, and at that same moment, the world was almost facing a breaking point as well, right? I mean, it was in the height of a pandemic that really highlighted the flaws in the capitalist system. It highlighted the inequities within the world, you know, and it showed the greed of the US as it, you know, hoarded its vaccines and all of that. And, you know, I think this moment globally and within the United States sort of allowed for this breaking point to happen. And the movements sort of played off each other in a way, right? I think we spoke about it in our local anti-war work here, where we were saying, you know, the movement for Black lives, as Kobi was saying, which again, after decades and decades and consistently seeing, you know, videos and examples of systematic oppression, you know, that sparked a wave of resistance that we hadn't seen before. And I think that made it a lot more acceptable for other movements to also start to take on that more, you know, heated sense of resistance, you know, and I think that impacted, at least in the United States, the protests here, you know, at least in our work, like you could really see how before the uprisings for Black lives in the last year or two, you wouldn't have seen, I don't think, as many numbers, and people so bold, you know, so boldly taking the streets, so boldly resisting orders to, you know, stay on sidewalks or whatever it might be. And I think, you know, that helped to embolden and encourage the pro-Palestine activist community in the United States too.
Yeah, and I'll just add too, I think in the Israeli regime hoarding vaccines, you know, and touting their like 95% vaccination rate, ignoring the fact that Palestinians are denied vaccines and denied healthcare coverage you know, for their hospitals. It really, you know, it added insult to injury at a time when people were fed up. And so it was, you know, another underlying factor that really, it made people ready and primed to resist the apartheid regime in Israel.
Yeah. So I didn't know if we have any questions. So those were my questions for you all. Thank you so much for answering them and providing that analysis. I don't know if we have any questions. Let's see from the chat. So I'm going to see. Okay. Let me go over here. Multitasking here. All right. Here we go. As a new and arguably more belligerently racist government takes power in Israel, what changes, if any, do you foresee happening in the struggle for Palestinian liberation? Okay, so I guess this could go to anybody really. So the question is basically with the new belligerent, very racist government in Israel, what do you see that this will lead to any, do you think this will lead to any changes in the struggle for Palestinian liberation?
Well, I do think that the current stage is primed for more resistance. I think that we will see increasing levels of violence on the part of the Israeli government, but I think it'll be met with more resistance and a more united resistance, both within the occupied 48. People in Sheikh Jarrah are primed to fight back against every home eviction. And I think the narrative in the US is changing dramatically, right? No longer can they act like, oh, the Palestinians are just resisting for no reason, but they're resisting occupation and they're resisting home evictions and violence by settlers. So I think that while we'll see more violence on the state by the state of Israel, I think we're going to see a greater resistance and a greater united front against it, which is really, really exciting. But it will be hard to watch. I mean, inevitably more children are killed in Palestine with all of these cases. And so I think it really just adds to the level of importance for revolutionaries and people who care what's happening in Palestine to speak out and to join with protests in the streets, because we're seeing a tipping point where the question is really opened up. And so we need to be at the forefront talking about resistance and actually making sure that people understand that Palestinians have a right and have the right to resist and will continue to resist at every stage as every home is stolen in Sheikh Jarrah in Jerusalem, as rockets are fired in Gaza. There will be resistance, and we need to be there standing up and saying that's righteous, that resistance is righteous, and that we need to be supporting it, especially as revolutionaries. This is a path that we aspire to. And so we need to be there at the forefront saying resistance is righteous and is something that we need to support. Really, in Minneapolis, we saw this in the streets when people lit a police station on fire. And kind of the liberals were up in arms and worried about property, much like Kobi said. And we upheld it, right? Like, Freedom Road, it is great. Resistance is important, and resistance is something that we need to be excited and to talk about and to uplift.
Awesome, Tracy. Yeah, most definitely. And I think, and I don't know, Kobi, maybe you might be able to speak to this a bit more, but I think in a way, what Tracy said about how that would lead to increased resistance, I mean, we saw something similar under Trump, right? I mean, where you did have sort of a more openly, and I say more openly racist, because both parties and most leaders are largely two sides of the same coin, but a more openly racist rhetoric, and that led to a lot of resistance to it. And I think, and the good thing is, I don't think we've really seen it die down, right? I think people were scared that it would die down, and it didn't. I don't know if you want to speak to that.
Yeah, I think something just like historically, there are some cats that cannot be put in the bag. Once the resistance reaches a certain level, it doesn't go back, right? We're not going back to the days when there was no resistance. We're not history doesn't move backwards, and something about imperialism, Cassia, you mentioned that all over the world, imperialism is a crisis, because as a global system, it is very, very unstable. It creates the conditions for itself to be overthrown by oppressing people and by concentrating resources in so few people's hands. It incentivizes people to fight back. So as long as imperialism exists, people are going to fight back more and more. And as people fight back more and more, it has to become more reactionary and more openly vicious. The upside to that is that the lies that they used to tell about how democratic, they used to call, I'm sure some people still do, they used to call Israel the only democracy in the Middle East, which is so ridiculous, but more and more people are realizing how ridiculous that is, because as Palestinians are resisting more and more vigorously, and as more and more oppressed people around the world are joining into that resistance, and workers are joining in that resistance, the lies don't work anymore. So it's a historical necessity that imperialism is going to crumble. And we're watching it crumble every day. It's speeding up. It's becoming more and more apparent. So we just have to keep fighting and keep pushing, and not letting things die. We have to put our feet on the pedals and keep resisting.
Absolutely. Thanks, Kobi. Thanks, Tracy. I think we have a few more just sort of comments and maybe a question or two before we let you guys go for the night. So we have a comment on the live stream. Meredith says, I think a factor in the Twin Cities was the movement for Black Lives. The Black Lives movement has changed our city and has changed what people are willing to believe from the news and the elite. And boy, if that's not the truth, most definitely. And I think a lot of us spoke to this already, but that's absolutely the case. I think people are starting to understand what the role of the news media is, and what power we have as people, and why it's important for us to also have our own news, which perhaps is a perfect moment for me to plug Fight Back News, which, you know, especially in these moments, guys, in these moments where they're trying as hard as they possibly can to sell you some sort of narrative, and we know that it's not the truth. You know, in the age of the internet, it's easy to find all sorts of different truths, right? But if you want the truth, you got to go to Fight Back News. It's the news and views from the people's struggles, and that's where you can get the most up-to-date, most accurate information about these different struggles for liberation, both internationally and within the United States. You know, labor struggles, women's rights struggles, LGBTQ, environmental, and of course, the struggle against US imperialism and for Palestinian liberation. So maybe we can get that somewhere in the chat. I'm sure it's in there. All right. So that's Fight Back News. And let's see, we have another question. I think, Tracy, you answered this one. I don't know if you want to reiterate it, because it's an important point. This question's from Joe, which is, why did the US Palestinian community display historic mobilizations when we saw the wars in Gaza in previous years actually killed more people? So, you know, why now? And I know you already hinted at it, but.
Yeah, I talked a little bit about it, but the Palestinian struggle, like in the Twin Cities, doesn't happen in a vacuum, right? Last year, there was a police station burned. Like, people are ready to resist, and they are watching the Israeli apartheid colonial settler state just like up their antics. And so we need to fight back more. And so more people came out, more people were ready to push that envelope in a way that they hadn't been in previous times, because it's untenable. Like what the Israeli regime is doing, hoarding vaccines, you know, shutting down and bombing schools in Gaza, like that is not something that we can take lying down anymore. So it's exciting to see the resistance up there, you know, up the level too.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And we saw, again, I mean, what came out of I think the big thing, you know, when you see the actual people in Palestine resisting so much, and you spoke already as to why they did and why it was such an unprecedented thing, that's what leads to the protests here, right? Like, we're protesting in solidarity with the resistance, you know, and so the larger, the more continuous the resistance is in Palestine, the more you're going to see people taking the streets.
Yeah, it's great how, you know, it like just feeds on itself. And so, you know, the reality is it's really easy for us to take a street if you compare it to people streaming in through Jordan, through a border that is protected by razor wire and IDF soldiers with giant AK-47s. Like, we can take the streets, and we should be taking the streets.
Agreed. Hear, hear. All right. Kobi, did you want to add anything to that one?
No, I mean, I think I said already that, you know, every wave of resistance is stronger than the one before it, because the system is, it's creating the conditions for its own death. And, you know, we just have to kill it. We just have to, you know, use those conditions, raise the level of consciousness, raise the level of struggle, and keep fighting, and the system will fall.
All right. Well, on that note, I'm going to ask, I think, one more question from the chat that either of you guys, we actually spoke about this a little bit before we went live. Let's see. The question is about the one-state solution. So if either of you guys want to talk about that, I can also give input afterwards. The question is, can someone talk more about why FRSO and the PFLP support a one-state solution and not a two-state solution? And then there's a follow-up furthermore, can someone explain more about how a one-state solution would work? So if either of you guys want to tackle that, why the FRSO and PFLP support a one-state solution rather than two?
But I'll start, and then hopefully you guys can add to it. You know, if you look at the two-state solutions that are being proposed, West Bank and Gaza are not contiguous. That is not a state. If you look at the way that water resources are specifically put into what would be the Israeli state, that is not a workable solution. It means that that what would be a Palestinian state would always be under basically under the boot of the Israeli occupation, right, or of the Israeli state. There would be no airport in the Palestinian state. They would always have all of their borders basically controlled by Israel around both of these regions. They wouldn't have any connection between the two, and ignores 100% every Arab citizen that lives, every Palestinian that lives in the 48 territories. And so it's not a workable solution. It's like a fake proposal, a two-state solution that's been put forward. It's not even possible. What needs to happen is a one-state solution that would allow for the resources to be shared. It was one state before the imperialist forces decided that they were going to meddle and that they were going to fund Zionist forces coming in and pushing out Palestinians from their land. And I'll add just one more part that makes this 100% untenable, is that Palestinians that were kicked out of their lands have a right to return. That is in international law, and it is no Palestinian refugee lives in Jordan believing that that will be their home. They aren't granted citizenship when they move to other parts of the world. In most cases in the region, they don't have citizenship. They're treated as second-class citizens wherever they're living, because they believe that they know they have a right to return. And so the only way that that is possible is in a one-state solution. So I think I'm looking like these two are ready to jump on that. So I'm going to stop there.
Yeah, I just want to add, there's a lot of a lot of people out there will say, oh, it's complicated. Nobody really knows what to do. Nobody knows how to handle it. But the actual fact of the matter, it's a very simple fact, is that land was stolen. There are people who, within their living memory, they were thrown out of their homes. Their homes are still there. They still have the keys. That land was stolen from them, and they have the right to return to that land. And when we say from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, we're not saying that that there's going to be some kind of genocide of Jews. What we're saying is that the genocide that is happening right now, the real genocide, not a hypothetical genocide that might happen when Palestinians are free, but the real actual genocide of Palestinians right now needs to end. And those Palestinians need to be empowered over their own land. And it's the same as in South Africa. There were all kinds of nonsense proposals about let's have the white state over here and the Afrikaner state over there, and no, this is stolen land and it needs to be given back. And that's what's going to happen. Regardless of what anyone says, that land belongs to Palestinians, and it will be given back. And the last thing I'll say is, Israel doesn't even have they don't have a set idea of where their borders should be. They want to steal everything. They want to steal. They've been taking land from Syria. They've been taking land from Lebanon. They've been taking land from Egypt. So when Palestinians say from the river to the sea, that is a righteous claim to land. But when Israelis say, we have the right to this land, that's a fake colonialist claim to land, far beyond any actual borders. So again, Palestinians have the right to return. That is their land. It's a very simple fact.
Yep. I have nothing else to add to that. You all both covered the points I was going to make. Although I'll also add that the Israeli governments for decades have made it a point to make it totally impossible, right? So out of one part of the mouth, you're saying a two-state solution, and with the other part of your mouth, you're talking about expansion and taking all this land, and they're making settlements throughout the West Bank, and they're putting settlements throughout East Jerusalem, and they're putting they're expanding, they're blocking off Gaza, they're putting all these checkpoints. So at the same time, with one hand, you're shaking your hand for peace, and on the other hand, you're literally building settlements with your left hand, So they've literally intentionally made it so that, a two-state solution would never even be able to be put into practical. When people talk about practicality, it's very impractical, right? And that's an intentional move as well, to sort of keep the status quo and to allow Israel to slowly encroach, I have at this point quickly encroach upon the lands and rights of the Palestinian people. Did you all want to add anything else before we close out?
Let's see. I'll add just quickly too, if people know the PFLP logo includes, basically an outline of Palestine with an arrow coming in, because, in their estimation, the refugees are what will make a one-state solution the only option. And so it's 100% true. There's millions of Palestinian refugees throughout the world, and they want to return to their homes. So we support the right of return 100%.
Yeah, just one thing I want to add about, a different question that I talked about earlier. Another link, like a very, very fundamental link between the situation of Black people in the US and the situation of Palestinians and the situation of oppressed people all over the world is that we've, for hundreds of years, been denied the right to self-determination. We have the right to decide what goes on in our own communities, our own nation, our own people. The institutions that affect our lives should be under our control. So that's why Black people in the U.S. Since the days of the Black Panther Party have been fighting for community control of the police, and that was a demand that came up that we've been pushing for a very long time, and have pushed very, very hard during the rebellion last year, because as long as we don't have the right to decide, what the police are doing, as long as we don't have the right to control the police budget, for example, to control police policy, the police are just going to keep doing what they want to do. And it's the same as long as Palestinians don't have the right to control their land. The Zionist occupation state is going to keep doing whatever it wants to do. So all over the world, oppressed people have the right to self-determination, and that's on a fundamental level what we're fighting for.
That's a perfect way, in my estimation, to end what I think has been a really awesome, really informative webinar. I want to give a huge thanks and shout out to Tracy and Kobi. Thank you all so much for the deep and astute analysis that you had to provide us about the current goings on in Palestine, the path forward for Palestine and the Palestinian movement in the United States as well, and the movement for Black lives within the United States and the connection between the two. I think this was a really important conversation for us to have today in this moment, in this unprecedented moment of resistance. And I hope that people at home, if this was intriguing to you in any way, that you'll find links to various groups within the different cities that we all operate in. You'll also find links for how to join Freedom Road's socialist organization. And of course, you will find links to Fight Back News, where you can keep up with the daily struggles of people across the globe and within the United States. So with that, again, thank you so much, Tracy. Thank you, Kobi. And thank you to everybody who tuned in to listen. It has been an absolute honor to host this webinar. And I hope to see you all again soon.
Thanks to Michaela for tech support. Hey,
hey Michaela. And from the river
Palestine
to the sea,
will be free.
We'll be free. Have a great night, everybody.